I take the wisdom from others and incorporate it into my life if it brings me into being a fuller, better, more loving, compassionate human. Meditating for 12 minutes a day, all it takes is 8 weeks for the actual structures in your brain to change.
Between belief and unbelief, faith and doubt, certainty and uncertainty, there is space. Each of us is thrown into this place to love, to ache, to rage, to heal, and to experience the wonder and the mystery of being. What's going on, everybody? Welcome to the wonder and the mystery of being. This is episode 17, and today my guest is Dr. Katie Blake. Katie has a Ph.D. in social psychology, and also she is a 500-hour master's level yoga instructor. And those two things combined really give her a very unique perspective for someone who's undergone a period of religious deconstruction like she has. So she's basically a way more educated version of me. And I was excited to talk with Dr. Katie because her perspective, particularly on Eastern thought, sort of where the yoga stuff came from for her, has been really interesting to me. And we've been talking privately about all the ways in which we can learn from some Eastern practices, whether it's yoga or whether it's Buddhist ideas or some Taoist ideas. Some of these ideas, for those of us that grew up in the West, are a little bit difficult to sort of put our fingers on. It does seem like Western thought is much more concrete. Like we're obsessed with things being what they are and being very clearly defined. And it seems to me, from my sort of uneducated perspective, I've learned about this stuff a little, but I'm certainly not an expert. It seems to me that in Eastern thought, there's a little bit more of a willingness to embrace ambiguity and mystery and wonder, which are things that you all know I love. So I was excited to get Dr. Katie's perspective on what deconstruction has been like for her, and also what it's been like for the women that she coaches through the process now. So in this conversation, we touch on her personal journey, and we also touch on some of the ideas around Eastern thought and philosophy that have been really helpful for us in this process that we call deconstruction. Before we get into it, I just want to remind you, if you're watching on YouTube and you don't subscribe, please hit that subscribe button. It really helps us out with the algorithm. And that like button, we appreciate that too. And if you're listening on a podcast, same thing goes. If you subscribe to the podcast feed, that really helps us in the rankings and gets us a bit more visibility. So with all that said, I just want to share this awesome conversation with you. It was one of my favorite conversations I've had for this show, and I hope you all enjoy it too. Please enjoy my conversation with Dr. Katie Blake. Let's start with who is Dr. Katie Blake? Yeah, so what is the work that, let's start with the work that you do now before we do too much background. What is what do you spend most of your time doing?
Okay, yeah. So to start with, the work that I'm doing right now is helping women through deconstruction. I feel like really there are many different ways to approach deconstruction. There can be like a theological approach. There's just a lot of different streams. For me, it's more giving people a foundation to enter into their own process and their own journey of deconstruction. So it's a lot of psychological tools, but also experiential practices, things like yoga and meditation and breathing and centering, grounding practices. But that's essentially what I'm doing these days. I spent some time teaching yoga, but I decided to make that pivot and shift to help women who are specifically deconstructing, because I felt like it was this great intersection of my story and my background. And so, yeah, that's essentially what I'm doing these days. That's how I spend my time, all my time.
That's awesome. So you're not teaching yoga anymore, or you still are a little bit? So
before I made the transition to work with women who are deconstructing, I really decided to stop teaching in-person yoga classes unless the gig was like super cool. So there's a really awesome museum in town, and they'll ask me occasionally to go teach classes in one of their art installations, and I'm always like a heck yes to that.
We're like, obviously I'm going to do that.
Yeah, because that's an awesome opportunity and just a really fun experience and unique and all of that. But actually before COVID, I was trying to take all of my teaching online, including my yoga. And I do teach at a local college. I teach psych classes. I've been doing that since 2007, teaching psychology at the collegiate level. So I still do that, but that's kind of more my side gig at this point.
That's so interesting. So this whole helping people through deconstruction thing has become like your main thing, your main focus. Yeah, that's amazing. So well, on that note, let's talk about how you got there. Like, what's your background with faith, and kind of what did you come up in, and then what needed deconstructing in your life?
Yeah, so I feel like for everyone that's such a multifaceted question, but I grew up in the church.
It super is. Answer it any way you want to. Yeah.
Yeah, I grew up in the church, born and raised. I mean, just about as traditional probably as you could imagine, going to church every Sunday, Wednesday, all the things, the summer activities, the soup kitchen experiences, all the stuff, right? And I grew up in the Church of Christ stream. And so that's a pretty intense stream in and of itself. And my grandmother had origins in that stream, and a lot of unhealth there as far as just the viewpoint of religion goes. I think, though, if I really think back, I've always been a little deconstructionist, I think. Even I think of when I was in 6th grade, so I guess I was 12, a Sunday school teacher had everyone stand up in the class. And he said, okay, so now if you've been baptized, sit down. And at that point in my life, I had not been. And so I was one of the few remaining still standing up. And he said, all of you standing up are going to hell. He said this in the class. 12 years old. Yes. And even at that point in time, I think I was able to call a BS flag on that a little bit. And
good for you.
To recognize that that was not the God that I knew, the experience that I had had with religion or spirituality. So, I mean, in college, I kind of bounced out of the Church of Christ stream. I went to a big state university, and so it was more the norm to have friends who didn't go to church than to have friends who did, and it was a little bit of freedom there. And I ebbed and flowed into some different streams, and then found myself marrying a man who was a Church of Christ minister later on, so I found myself back in that stream. And then, as you know, when your occupation is centered around this thing that you have to buy into, a lot more weight comes with it. And so that's when I think I really began my formal deconstruction, while he was working in ministry and I was serving alongside him in that. But I do think that my entire life I've been just a little peeking behind the curtain, asking questions. That's
interesting.
Yeah. Whether doing that publicly, there's definitely been a journey and a waving through, okay, I'm going to keep this to myself, or I'm going to actually do this out loud. But yeah.
You've got to kind of wonder, when you're 12 years old and someone tells you you haven't been baptized, so you're going to hell. If you have an intuition that there's something not right with that, it sort of makes me go, where's that intuition coming from? Because for the most part, kids more or less tend to accept the reality with which we're presented, with that they're presented with. And so there was something in you, something else that you learned somewhere that you were drawing on, to say this is not okay.
Yeah.
What do you think that might have been?
Gosh, that feels like a huge question. I don't know.
Yeah.
I want to pick a safe answer, and I want to say, like, my mom was always open-minded, and she was always, like, introducing to me to the Beatles and stuff like that. And, I think somewhere underneath it all, she was a hippie at heart, and a free spirit. So that's my safe answer. But I think my gut answer is more mystical and more just ethereal, and just that, I think we all kind of have an inner knowing. And I think that seems really evident when you're with kids. And I think that culture and society, socialization, modeling, all of that tends to water that down and mask it. And so I don't know that's anything unique about me or my story. I think we all have that somewhere. It's just whether or not we allow it to be erased, essentially.
Right. Well, and in this process, I mean, you talked about this deconstruction process looking different for different people, and I've certainly seen that up close, because my process and then my partner Jess's process looked completely different. Mine was much more like my nose in a book for 2 years, or in many books for 2 years, and hers was much more, I guess, like getting a sense of embodiment and realizing how sort of disembodied she'd been living, and learning to trust her instincts and trust when she sort of has a gut feeling about something. And so it sounds like yours was maybe there was something going on in you early on in that vein. It sounds like that you were like trusting something in your gut. Yeah,
for sure. I mean, I think that's unique to us as women. I think that we have a heightened intuition that we learn not to listen to. But I'm also an Enneagram 5, I should say. So the initial steps of my formal deconstruction were all about theology and learning, and asking questions about information and gathering more information. And so I definitely went down that deep dive as an adult. But yeah, as a kid, I think it was more just like, what is truth, and how do I tap into that? And how do I not just believe what other people have told me just because that's what we do around here, right?
Yeah. So how did that, to go back to sort of the moment where you and your husband are back in this sort of church system, and he's pastoring and you're the supportive pastor's wife, more or less, I would assume. What was that experience for you? What was that experience like in your relationship? And then, how did that affect your husband and your, each of your perceptions of your roles? What did that look like for you guys?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because this is a common theme that I hear from women that I'm working with all of the time. And I didn't talk to my husband about what was going on within me for years. I mean, years. I was too afraid to bring it up. I didn't know what he was going to think. I knew we weren't probably on the same page. And so that was a really scary thing. And this is something I hear all the time from women. And that's really kind of the last piece that they're afraid to let go to, is talking to their husbands. And to me, that feels super sad, but it's super relatable because that was my story. So gosh, I don't know. It probably took me 5 years before I started talking to him about it.
Wow,
for me,
that's a long time.
Yeah, it's a long time. And so I do feel like I learned the hard way that that's not the way to do it. I feel like, honestly, in relationships, which is kind of my jam as far as psychology goes, it's really communication is the biggest piece, I think, to healthy relationships. And, you got to start there with a lot of things, even if it's just dipping your toe in the water. And I definitely didn't do that. And now I see hindsight how that was creating a lot of resentment in me, because I was, as Brene Brown might say, like creating stories in my head about what he was thinking and what he would think if I shared this and that. And a lot of it just wasn't true. I mean, when I finally kind of expressed how I was feeling and shared that with him, he was like, okay, and yeah, me too.
Wow, and you must have been so relieved, right? Like,
yeah.
Was that just a huge relief to you that you're like, oh my gosh, you are not upset, you understand?
Yeah, a huge relief. I mean, we've definitely had our ups and downs, and we definitely don't align on everything. And there are some kind of big ticket items still that we're working out, of course, but that's, again, to a relationship and a marriage, as you probably know.
Yeah.
And but communication is so key, just to stay open with that. And I learned that so the hard way.
Yeah. Wow. I mean, I can't imagine how you must have felt during those years.
Yeah.
I mean, it must have been a really lonely thing for you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's something I hear a lot from the women I work with as well, is just that loneliness piece. And when you're deconstructing and you're afraid to talk about it because you aren't sure if you're going to be ostracized or rejected, it's a lonely spot. Yeah. And I navigated that alone for a really long time until I stumbled upon a podcast. And then I realized there was this world of people who were doing this thing that I didn't even know was called deconstruction. And so that was kind of a new opening up, to have that opportunity to not feel alone. And, oh my gosh, those people think that Genesis is poetic too, you know?
Yeah. It's a real relief to discover other people going through the same process as you. Because I like you, I was going through it very much alone. I didn't have a community of people that was sort of on the same journey. Jess was very supportive and very understanding, but didn't totally understand. And she felt a lot of the same things that I felt, but she was a little hesitant to like dive in with both feet. You know, is that the right phrase? With both feet?
Maybe
in
head
with
first.
both feet? Head first,
feet,
yeah.
it works.
Yeah. So she was just a little hesitant. And so I was, really on the journey on my own. And for me, it's like when COVID hit, after a couple months of lockdown, that's honestly what instigated me starting to talk about it publicly, because I was like, well, life has basically been destroyed anyways. Yeah. Yes. Like I remember Jess and I were in a grocery store, and all the tape lines, on the ground where you walk, and everyone's in masks, and that's a new thing at that time. And we were just like, wow, this is like apocalyptic. Like, the whole world is destroyed, so might as well start being honest about what we think, So, but one of the things that was a huge relief for me is when I started talking about it, discovering that I was far from the only one. And so I imagine a lot of the people that you work with find a lot of comfort in even just the connection of being able to talk about this stuff openly, right?
Yeah, and that's why I think what you're doing by having this podcast and just the different things that you're talking about on social media and that kind of stuff, it really gives people an outlet to recognize that they're not alone. Like for me, stumbling on a podcast, I didn't know anyone related to that podcast, but it was still an opening up for me. And I find that all the time, where people will DM me and say, gosh, I didn't know there was a word for this. Gosh, I didn't know anyone else was doing the same thing. And it just feels like a real gift to have received that for me years ago, and now to be able to give that back to people. And so I just love it.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things I wanted to ask you about is that we've talked about this privately a little bit, but of all the people that I've gotten to know in this sort of like loose deconstruction space that we sort of are participating in, you incorporate a lot of sort of Eastern philosophical ideas and practices. And I'm sure the fact that you have such a rich background in yoga has something to do with that. When I was sort of deconstructing everything, I learned a lot. One of my phases, I went through like a bunch of different phases. I'm sure you did too. One of my phases was studying other religions or other sort of philosophies that would have been probably taboo before, as a Christian. And, some of them I read a little bit about, and I was like, oh, okay, I feel like I know enough about that, so I can move on. But it was like Buddhism and elements of some of the other Eastern philosophies, Taoism, a little bit of Hinduism. Some of that stuff felt really interesting to me because it was like a completely different way of approaching spirituality than I had encountered before. How do you, this is a very broad question, so feel free to dive in any way you want, but how do you sort of incorporate Eastern philosophical ideas or practices into your work with the people that you sort of work with on this deconstruction stuff?
Yeah. I think I want to preface all of that by saying I'm still a student.
Yeah.
You know, I'm forever a student and learning. This is not my tradition of heritage. And so I'm just grateful to be a student of a lot of these streams, and so grateful to the teachers that I've had who have been willing to be open and have been willing to show me, you know, a new way of seeing the world. And yeah, so for me, coming from a psychology background, I have been trained to view everything through like a biopsychosocial model, right? Which is so important. But sometimes in fundamental Christianity, we get stuck in this like thinking and beliefs.
Yeah.
And it's very one-sided. And as an Enneagram 5, I find myself there all the time, right?
Yeah.
You know, like, what can I know more of?
Right.
I need to know all the things.
Knowledge and reason and belief. These are like, it's very structured. Yeah.
Yeah. In fact, just 2 days ago, I was on a chat with an Enneagram expert, and she was talking about the different fears of all the numbers. And she was like, the fears of the 5 is the fear of not knowing or the fear of incompetency. And I'm
Interesting.
like, yes, that is so true for me. I need to know all of the things before I can take a step.
Right.
But I think there is a lot of health in, like what you were saying about Jess, that we bring in embodiment, but we also bring in the thinking, and we bring in the belief structures and all of that. The theology, like your own experience, is so important. But we're also tapping into the mind, body, spirit. And I did practice yoga for a while, but as many Westerners do, it was a workout for me initially. Right. And I got into like the hot yoga, and that was super cool because at that time I was like running marathons, and I was just into like, you know,
hot yoga is amazing. Like,
it's amazing.
So for anyone like watching or listening to this, first off, yoga is not just for women. I have done plenty of it. And in fact, I got really into this power yoga for a minute. It was like, it was, what's his name? Bob.
Oh.
He's actually kind of obnoxious.
Sure.
He was one of the coaches on The Biggest Loser, but he had like a yoga, like a power yoga DVD.
I love it.
You probably wouldn't like him if I'm being honest. Well, maybe you would. I mean, I don't know, but he's a little obnoxious. But I got really into him. And then also when Jess and I lived in Nashville, there was a hot yoga studio not far from us, and we started going, and it was amazing because the first session, I mean, you know all about this, but for people that are watching and listening that aren't familiar with hot yoga, it's basically yoga in a room that's sauna-ish, and it's usually like 105 or so, something like that.
Yeah, it depends on the stream, but yeah.
Oh yeah. And when I went, the first experience I had, they basically told me, if you can stay in the room for the full hour,
right,
that's your goal for the first session. That's it. If you can do that. And I remember just being like, trying to do a few things, and I was like, yeah, Savasana, I'm out. But anyway, I totally interrupted you, but
no, you're good.
To that end, yeah, I agree. Like a lot of people get into yoga for exercise purposes, and that certainly was something that Jess and I both have gotten into. But there's a whole, oh
my goodness,
there's so much more to it than that.
Oh my goodness, I had no idea.
Well, and I'd love to learn a bit from you in this conversation about some of that stuff. What's really interesting to me is that's exactly the stuff that I was sort of taught to be most fearful of as a Christian. It's like, because I remember people saying like, oh, you shouldn't do, even though like yoga is good exercise, you shouldn't do it because you're opening yourself up to spiritual 100%. Stuff. And I remember being like, ooh, that sounds bad. I probably shouldn't do that.
Yeah.
But I mean, what has your experience been with all of that?
Yeah. It was the same for me. You know, that thing is evil. And I think when you come from a fundamentalist background, you're given like a list of like what's good, what's okay, and what's bad. And you stay away from the bad list. And the bad list is basically like everything but what the people are wanting you to do, right? And, you know, one of those things was yoga. And for me, I started in with an exercise approach towards it. And then I learned the breathing aspect of it. And then I began to realize, oh, this is the exact thing that I was taught as a PhD student in psychology, except there we call it biofeedback. So with breathing and yoga, it's pranayama, right? Yep. And so it's learning how to control your mind, learning how to control your body through your breath. But in psychology, it's biofeedback, and it's the same thing. It's learning how to control your mind, control your body, that stress cycle that's happening in your body through your breath. And that it takes literally 15 to 30 seconds to take yourself from this space of stress and anxiety to calm and serenity. I mean, that's it. And we have the tools to do that at our disposal at any moment of any day. We don't need meds. We don't need a teacher. We don't need a guru. We can use our breath. And so I entered into that, and that was really juicy for me because, you know, I have a tendency to be on the anxious side, to get stressed and that kind of thing. And being able to learn to use my breath to calm myself down was gold. Yeah. And so it was kind of this step process where I was like, oh, I'm opening up to that. Oh, there's also that, right? And then my love for that just overflowed into wanting to teach it. And I was like, why not learn to be an instructor? And maybe I'll use it, maybe I won't. Again, I'm
that
a forever
makes me
student.
want to learn.
Oh my gosh, it's the best, really. I mean, if you are finding any kind of gift from the yoga practice, going into a yoga teacher training certification process is the best. And really you should enter it in with, okay, I'm going to do this for myself and for self-growth instead of like something else I can do as an occupation or something like that.
Because we tend to, especially in Western culture, we tend to have this like, how can I commodify this interest that I have? You know, and I'm guilty of that for sure. I have a sort of an entrepreneurial mind, and so I just tend to go like, oh, how can I turn this into a thing, you know? I'm deconstructing, let's make a podcast, you know? Like, so this is, but that really speaks to me because I've found with the, like meditation practices, for instance, have sort of replaced prayer for me in a sense.
1000%.
Replaced actually isn't the right word because I don't even feel like it's like I stopped praying and I started meditating. It's like the two were never different. Yeah, it's more like that.
Exactly.
Yeah. But I started exploring meditative practices that I would have been freaked out about before. And so
totally.
I know people have different opinions of Deepak Chopra, but he had a few meditations that I learned that were really helpful for me. And he has one in particular that's like a 60-second one that I memorized, and I use it when I get stressed out. It's just four ideas. It's loving, or it's joyful, energetic body, loving, compassionate heart, reflective, alert mind, lightness of being. And I sort of just, I stop, I close my eyes, I take a few breaths, I say that first phrase a couple of times, focus on the idea, and then the second one and the third one and the fourth one. It takes maybe 60 seconds, like you said. And at the end of it, I'm like, wow, like that actually changed my state.
Oh my goodness, yeah.
Significantly.
Yeah, I think for me, as I was getting my PhD, I was studying relationships. That's kind of the stream that I come from, a relationship research background. And, you know, studying what makes healthy relationships and unhealthy relationships. At the time, I was studying social support, and I became interested in cultural psychology and what even is culture. And, you know, what makes us different, but what really ultimately is the same about humanity. And so in my dissertation, I was studying this idea of collectivism and individualism, which I'm sure you've maybe heard of.
Yeah.
And what I found through that research is that there was really a lot of beauty and a lot of benefit to a collectivistic society, which was not the society of which I was a part of or had ever been a part of.
We're not used to that.
No. And so that was a taste, right? It was a taste in my fundamentalist upbringing of, not everything on the outside is bad. There is some beauty in some of these other streams. And and so I feel like that opened me up to how can I look at some of these other practices that could possibly have fruit to it or beauty to it. And so I think that's what helped me step into yoga. So for anyone listening who is like, no, that's an absolute no and an off limits thing. I mean, for me, it's just how can I find the beauty and the goodness in other things that may make me a more compassionate person or a more centered person, like what you're talking about, where it only takes 60 seconds for you to transition your experience of any given present moment. And for me, it's really hard to deny the wisdom in that.
And I love how you worded that too, how you said present moment, because that's another thing that I've focused on a lot, just as far as my own mental state, is recognizing that very often when I'm thinking about the past, it's in the form of regret or rehashing things and going like, I wish I had done that differently, or I could have done that differently. And when I'm thinking about the future, it's very often in the form of worry. So it's like by projecting myself into either the past or the future, it's like it's typically taking me to sort of a negative, it can often take us to like negative spaces. And so much for me has been returning to the present and going like, hey, what am I doing right now? Like when I'm with my kids, I don't want to be thinking about like the work I have to do tomorrow. I want to be like my daughter grabs my hand and says, play with me, Daddy. I want to be like, hell yeah, I'm going to play with you. Like, let's play something ridiculous, you know? How to be present in the moment. That's something I feel like I'm constantly trying to get better at. What were some of the, if you started noticing in these Eastern sort of traditions, some things that you had already been learning about in psychology, how did you sort of make the transition into actually focusing on them more directly? Yeah.
I mean, as I said, I'm forever a student. I think I started to say this earlier and I got onto something else.
No, I probably interrupted you. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Not at all. So I defended my dissertation in the same month I started my yoga teacher training. It was like, okay, check that. That's the Enneagram 5 aspect. It was like, check that. Now what else? Yeah. And, it's a good thing, but it's kind of an Achilles heel too of always wanting to like master stuff. And so, yeah, that's how I jumped into the yoga teacher training. I had this openness in my schedule now, right? And so it was like, let me jump into that 2 feet first or head first, whichever one you want to say.
Yeah. We haven't established exactly what the right phrasing is there.
Yeah. And, like I said, I went into it just as maybe more of a spiritual journey and a way to, at that time I wasn't formally deconstructing, but as a way to just kind of grow myself as an individual. And man, once I jumped in, it was just a whole new world. And then there was no stopping it. And so just the wisdom in the traditions, and I guess I'm speaking about yoga specifically, but even like Zen Buddhism, some things that I've studied beyond my yoga teacher training, there's just so much wisdom in those traditions and there's so much benefit there. And I don't mean that in like a selfish sense. For me, kind of to nod back to what you were saying earlier about meditation and prayer, growing up in fundamentalist Christianity, like the big thing is like die to self and you should be a compassionate person,
Yes.
all this stuff. And that was always to me kind of like an end goal. But to be frank, all of the tools that I was taught throughout Christianity, none of them brought me into a deeper sense of compassion as meditation. And so once I began to experience that, it was like, oh, like this is what really brings the benefit to my life. Because, as you know, once we open up to compassion, it's compassion for others, but then that overflows into compassion for self, which is huge as well.
Well, yeah, and I think for some people, sometimes it's the reverse.
Right.
So I think for some people, many people that I've talked to that grew up in sort of Christian, especially evangelical Christian spaces, that there's a tendency to sort of that whole die to self thing that you're talking about can sometimes teach us. And I don't think people intend to teach this, but it sort of happens where people learn that they have to deny themselves.
100%.
They actually shouldn't love themselves because that's bad, right? Like you should view yourself as this small thing, make yourself as small. I mean, like I must decrease so he must increase. Like how many times have we heard that? And it's like, well, I mean, what happens when someone continually tries to make themselves smaller and smaller and smaller and more insignificant, more insignificant, more insignificant? You get into this cycle of self-hatred and self-loathing, and you don't learn to love who you are. And I know I was always a little overconfident, so that wasn't my particular problem. But I have, like Jess, for instance, like that was a big struggle for her, is that she felt like she learned that it was bad to love herself. She learned that that she should be suspicious of any good thing that came into her life, or that she should, it would be bad to want things for herself. That kind of thing. And what I've seen in her is as she's gone through this journey, she has learned to love who she is so much more. And I know that sounds like hippie woo woo, but like there's something very real going on there. And I've seen it then from that ability for her to love and appreciate who she is and to love herself. Then out of that flows this ability to like really have compassion and love for other people, because she's like, I'm good. Now I can focus on some other people, and something about that doctrine of like, I must decrease thing.
Right.
It's like it keeps your cup empty.
Yeah.
And then demands that you pour it out for others.
Yeah.
And you can't pour from an empty cup.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so I love all of that. So you're getting into yoga. You've defended your dissertation. You've gone full on in yoga. And so you said you feel like you sort of had this increasing sense of compassion. Where did it kind of go from there?
Yeah, so I started teaching yoga classes in person, and I was teaching a ton of yoga classes, and had my own personal practice, because that's something that they teach you is huge, kind of like what you're saying, that it starts with your cup and then you pour out from that cup. So that's huge in this tradition, in the sense that those two things are important. And as a side note, that was 100% my story of what you're explaining about Jess. And it took a Rob Bell podcast for me, not too long ago, where he was talking about how we are to love others as ourselves. And the prerequisite to loving others well is to love ourselves well. And it was like one of those moments for me.
Light bulb.
Oh my goodness. And and I think that nods back to that idea of ahimsa, right? That you and I have talked about a lot.
Yeah.
And that's helped me a ton, where a lot of these, which I'm assuming you want to talk about some, the yamas and the niyamas.
I do.
Yeah, is that...
Let's go there.
It's all about how you are treating yourself, but it's also how you are treating others. And that some of these things like ahimsa are like, how am I non-harming to others, but how am I non-harming to myself? but also like satya, which is like being truthful. So in my experience of Christianity, it was always like you tell other people the truth. But when I began to learn about the yamas and the niyamas and the satya idea, it was like, no, but also you don't lie to yourself, you know? And so some of those things that you're talking about, and that's something I've really been marinating on, because again, I'm a current student of all of this over the last month, is like, how do I lie to myself? You know, like, so for me, I think there was along that path of going back to your question, but coming into a yoga teacher training experience and then teaching classes is then I began to incorporate a lot of this stuff into my life. And it really enhanced my spirituality. It enhanced the ways in which I moved about the world. And it changed a lot of that for me, because it really took what I was taught as a kid and growing up as a rule book and how I'm supposed to treat other people. And like, these are the things that you check and these are the things that you don't do. And this is the good, bad list. And it shifted that into just more of a way of like being into the world. And, you know, I think you hear people say this sometimes, and sometimes you think it's all a bunch of fluff or you don't really know how to understand it, but it's really hard to articulate a lot of this into words. Where I just went from that checklist in the rule book to, oh, this is how I'm supposed to exist in the world. And then you just go do it.
That was one of the things that I noticed when I started looking at any sort of Eastern thought, philosophy, or I sometimes hesitate to use the word religion because it almost doesn't seem like the right word sometimes. One of the things I noticed is that in sort of a Western way of thinking, again, that's also a generalization, but let's roll with it.
Right.
That it does tend to be a very structured, like, do this, checklist, and then you're good. What I learned from sort of Eastern thinking is a much more fluid. Things are not always defined. Like, one of the things I love about Taoism is like the first line of Taoism says, you know, or of Tao Te Ching, the first line is the Tao that can be told is not the eternal and unchanging Tao. So it's like the minute you define it and make it a checklist and make it a system, it's no longer the thing. Right. It's like you've made something else. And I love that. So I've really appreciated that way of thinking, because it feels like it maps onto reality so much more than this checklist thing, because all of our experiences are so unique. Yeah. And so to approach these ideas in a much more, it's almost like a squishier way. Like, instead of it being this hard thing, it's like this soft thing that gives and bends, you know?
That's malleable,
Yeah, and I love that. And it's harder to quantify. So there's a learning curve, especially for those of us that grew up in the West. It can be a really tricky thing. So, I mean, so you were getting into this. Maybe you could walk us through, for people that don't know what the yamas are. Maybe you could share a little bit about the yamas with us. Would that be okay?
Yeah, sure. And I'll say I'm still in the process of learning Sanskrit, and
oh, you are?
And well, not learning it, but just like intentionally wanting to treat it with honor and reverence, you know, because what I've been taught about the tradition of it is that it's the sounds of the words that, kind of like what you were just saying, it's the sounds of the words and the vibrations of the words rather than the meanings of the words. And so I want to preface all of that by saying I will not pronounce these correctly. I'm certain of it. And so for my friends who do have more experience in Sanskrit, I'm apologizing. And I'm trying really hard, I promise.
No, that's great. That's great.
But yeah, so there's 8 limbs in yoga. And what we often think is that movement is yoga in the West. We think that is the thing. And only one of those...
We think it's downward dog.
We think it's that, right?
Yeah.
We think it's like, you know, getting our fitness on and like the people wearing their Fitbits in the yoga class. And like, it's not that. It's actually only one of the 8 limbs. And it's the word asana, which means seat. So when you were talking about hot yoga and they were like, just stay in the room for the entire hour, you did yoga, you know?
Yeah.
I used to love saying this in my in-person classes. If you come in and you sit on your mat or you lie on your mat the entire time, you've succeeded.
Yeah, I have a friend that his joke was because he didn't really want to do it, but his wife wanted him to go. And so he said he would go and lie on the mat for an hour, and his wife was giving him crap about it one time. And he was like, I think he said something to the effect of "my mat, my practice," or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. I love it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so it's only one of the 8 limbs, which, for me, if we are viewing yoga in that way, we're just missing the point. It's like wearing the Fitbit to yoga class. You're missing the point. And so the yamas and the niyamas are 2 of the other limbs, and those are like the ways in which we go about living our lives internally and then externally. So how we treat ourselves and others. And those to me are the most interesting. But then you also have enlightenment and you have meditation, you have concentration, these other limbs. But the ones that impacted me the most are definitely the yamas and the niyamas. And that's where
I felt the same when I sort of, when I haven't studied them, I'm sure to the degree that you have. And obviously there's people out there that know way more than both of us about all this. But there were a few specific ones, and I'm struggling with the names even more than you, for sure. But there was a few specific ones that were really eye-opening for me, where I was like, whoa, that's an idea that you could think about for a year. Just on this one aspect of one limb of yoga. I was like, I could spend a year on that.
Do you remember what some of them were?
Yeah, see, I should probably have them pulled up. One of them, because some of the ideas are a little, something gets lost in the translation.
Yeah.
Because the one you were talking about, because there's one about deceit or lying, and it's like you're entirely right. You pinpointed it. It's like it's not exactly lying. It's sort of.
Right.
It's sort of operating in something other than the truth, even if you're not saying anything.
Right.
That's a lot. It's like, it's something more like that. But there's a lot of ideas like that where it's like we get tripped up in language, but the idea is something bigger than the word. There were a few like that for me, and I probably should actually just like look them up.
Well, I'll throw you a bone. So one for me is Asteya.
Thank you. You see me struggling? Yeah.
No, you're good. I totally understand it. One of them that I think is tapping into what you're talking about for me is this idea of non-stealing.
Yes.
And I was just talking about this to my husband like 3 days ago.
Because again, this is not about, it is about not stealing, but it's also,
It's not just, we think of the 10 Commandments and it's like you don't steal people's stuff, right? Like you don't steal money and you don't steal people's stuff. But this idea is like, I also don't steal people's time.
Yeah.
Like that one is huge.
Mm-hmm.
And so again, I think to me, it goes back to taking that checklist, like the 10 Commandments list of like, thou shalt nots. And it's like more a way of embodying yourself or embodying the world or embodying what it means to be a human or a compassionate human anyway. Mm-hmm. And so, I guess we could start with, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts that have developed about Ahimsa as we've talked about it. Mm-hmm. Because for me too, I've heard people say that it's the greatest religion. And obviously it's not a religion, right? So I'm not using that word to put a box on it or a label on it. But for me, that has been formative. Just to in every situation, how am I thinking about, and I'll tell everyone who's listening, if you're not familiar, it means non-harming, or it means, non-harming is probably the best way to describe it, but it means non-harming towards...
I've heard it, referred to as non-violence.
Right.
But I think non-harm is a better way to say it. I mean, so just, for the benefit of everyone listening and watching, one of the first interactions we had is, because I was talking about this idea of non-harm, which I do feel like was, I happened upon this idea basically from the idea of like, well, if I'm going to detach myself from Christianity, what am I grounding my morality in? And the most universal thing I could think of was an idea where it's like, well, I should focus on not harming anyone or anything unnecessarily. So like, and the more I thought about it, the more I was like, well, if the separation between humans and animals is sort of illusory, then maybe I need to extend my idea of non-harm to animals. So I went vegetarian 6 months ago. And again, that's a personal thing for me. I'm not trying to put that on anybody else. But it was just a thing of me exploring this idea of non-harm and going like, how far can I extend this? And I'm probably 95% vegetarian. Every once in a while I'm in a situation where it's just not practical. And then probably mostly vegan too. But that's hard. So that was the thing. And then I started thinking about it more broadly and thinking about like, well, how can I walk through life leaving the smallest footprints is sort of the way I started thinking about it. And going like, I know this is again very, very like hippie woo woo here, but I was like, even when I walk through a field, can I trample the least amount of grass?
So good.
Like, and I know how that probably sounds, but I just started thinking about life through that lens and going like, how can I do the most good and impact negatively the least amount of not just living things, but like the earth, Yeah. So there's an environmental aspect to it too. So I was processing all this stuff, and then you and I sort of started interacting, and you were like, "Oh, it sounds like you've gotten into Ahimsa," and I was like, I don't know this word," and then I looked into it, and I was like, "It's the word that exactly says what I've been thinking about."
So beautiful.
And so that was a gift that you gave me. So thank you for that. I do think it's a really powerful idea, and it's one of those ones that you could spend a lot of time thinking about just on that one aspect of one limb of yoga.
So good. Yeah. And just to speak on a gift, I think that's something too that I've learned out of the yoga tradition is that it's viewed as a gift. And then, that's where I didn't know it at the time. I wanted to become a teacher, but when you're given something that's that beautiful, you just want to keep passing it along, right? And when you first were talking about non-harming, I was like, this dude has been studying Ahimsa. And so I think I hit you up on Instagram and was like, you've been reading some Ahimsa. And you were like, what?
And that sort of speaks to something interesting, because you had you had an experience where you were studying stuff in psychology, and then you found it in Eastern thought.
Yeah.
And you were like, this is another path to this same thing. And in this process of deconstruction, I've experienced that many times, where it's like, oh, if I'm willing to go beyond the boundaries of what was considered acceptable in the sort of faith tradition I came up in, I discovered a lot of similar ideas. Like, for instance, like the golden rule, like treat others the way that you would want to be treated. That idea, a lot of people say that, that was Jesus's idea, because it was sort of in, it was in his teachings. I can't remember if it's in the Sermon on the Mount. I think it is. But like, if you look at that idea, there's versions of that idea in basically any religion that's ever existed, many of them vastly predating Christianity. And so I feel the same thing about Ahimsa. It's like there's something there that they figured out a long time ago. And then after the Enlightenment, like psychology, sort of science caught up or something like that. Was that your experience when you sort of started thinking about this stuff? Or
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's where I may step into some spaces where I'm like hippie woo-woo and people may...
It's great. I like hippie woo-woo. But
I tend to think we're all talking about the same thing a lot of the time. And, we all have different language for it, and we all have different ways of approaching it. And I guess when I'm talking about it, generally I'm also talking about like this experience of life and God or whatever you want to call it.
We can call it being.
And
yeah,
being. I love that. I mean, I love the wonder and the mystery of being. Like, you caught me hook, line, and sinker with that. But yeah, I feel like we're all just stumbling through and trying to come up with language for something that's ineffable. And that's where I keep coming back to, let me throw out the list of what I can't do and let me enter into these spaces where I was taught to teach people the way.
Yeah.
Like, I have the way and I'm going to come teach it to you. And instead, like, this is where I failed on some mission trips, because I would show up and I would be like, oh yeah, tell me about your culture and what you do. Oh yeah, that's so wise and so interesting. And, you know, the mission trip leaders didn't like that very much.
Because you were coming with curiosity.
Yeah. And I think that for me, it's like when that switched, where it was like, well, what can I learn from others?
Yeah.
And that's where I began to see those similarities. And so then how can I take the wisdom from others and with permission and with gratitude and with, just a willingness to honor that space and that tradition that's not mine, that heritage, to incorporate it into my life if it brings me into being a fuller, better, more loving, compassionate human. And one of those things for me was 100% meditation. And there's a great book by two neuroscientists, Andrew Newberg and Mark Robert Waldman, called How God Changes Your Brain.
Whoa.
And oh man, dude, you got to get this book on your list. I've been throwing books at you. But
as we're talking, I'm going to buy it on Amazon right now.
Yeah, everybody who's watching this, here's what it looks like. Go buy it immediately. Because I went into this yoga teacher training, and, really one of the big aspects of yoga is meditation. I mean, really that, I don't know that I could say it supersedes the movement. I think they're probably seen as there's equal male and feminine energy of being still and moving. But so I was experiencing this meditation, and like you, it was like, okay, this is like prayer, but it makes a little bit more sense to me. And it's a little bit easier because I don't have to bring anything.
Yeah.
Like in Zazen, Zen Buddhist meditation, the point is to empty yourself. And a lot of Christians freak out about that. But for me, that was really liberating.
Yeah.
And it was like, okay, I can just show up here and empty myself and just be. And then, maybe thoughts or insights or words or wisdom or whatever, or just sensations will come. And that's when I began to really experience this compassion that was different from anything I had ever experienced, from like showing up on the mission trips or going to serve at the prayer breakfast, or the other things that we're told to do to cultivate that gratitude and compassion for others. For me, it was meditation. And when I stumbled upon this book outlines exactly what is happening in your brain when you are meditating. And again, it was one of those aha moments where it was like, what I was experiencing through this other tradition was aligning with the science that me as a psychologist and an academic and an Enneagram 5 so values,
Wow.
So in this book, they find that, did you have a question?
No, I'm just keep going.
Yeah, you're going to love this. So in this book, they find that 12 minutes a day for 8 weeks, the actual literal structures in your brain change. Meditating for 12 minutes a day for 8 weeks. That's all it takes. So again, going back to like the breathing, all it takes is 15 to 30 seconds to change your experience of the world. All it takes is 8 weeks for the actual structures in your brain to change.
That's
like,
wild.
That is fascinating to me. Wild. And so for me, there's a lot of stuff in this book. But the two most amazing takeaways for me is that it suppresses activity in your amygdala, which is the structure in your brain that houses really like animalian, lizard-like emotions, namely fear and aggression. So it suppresses the activity in that structure, and it enhances activity in your anterior cingulate, which is where compassion is housed. And we are one of the few, I can't remember, maybe us and some other apes maybe possibly have this structure, but not all animals, not all beings have this structure in their brain. And meditation, it actually stimulates activity in that structure in the brain.
It's wild. So they've actually like looked at this
brain scans
and they've identified these areas of the brain and seen, because I know I've read a few studies about prayer and meditation and what parts of the brain are activated, but I hadn't read about like long-term effects. I was always reading about like what's happening in the moment.
Right.
That's really interesting. I mean, not to get all Enneagrammy, but I'm sort of equal parts 3 and 8. I more was a 3 before and more an 8 now, which is
I love
which
8s.
Sort of makes sense because I just challenge everything, so it sort of makes sense that I'm an 8. But like hearing that, I can only hear that as a challenge. So I'm just like, I'm going to do this 12 minutes a day for 8 weeks. I'm going to do this. I'm going to start tomorrow.
Yeah, so I'm a 5 and I go to 8 in health. So anytime someone is like, I'm an 8, I'm like, we're instantly friends.
Yeah.
2, I feel like 8s get a bad rap. But yeah, I'm going really Enneagrammy on you today.
No,
too, so
it's funny. I did the Enneagram a couple years ago and I was a 3. And that was, and I think like it gives you a few that like are you recommend people get into meditation?
Yeah, I definitely recommend starting with guided meditation. If you are like, okay, I'm going to start today and I'm going to sit in silence for 60 minutes.
It's really hard.
I'm here to tell you, like, that is not going to happen.
Yeah.
You won't succeed. And yeah, also another thing that I'm really big on is rituals and rhythms. And just from like a psychological standpoint too, you have to do the same thing every day. I'm so sorry to tell you that. Like, you really have to do it every day. Because if you start, the way that the brain works, if you start to do this, like, I'm going to do it on Sundays and Mondays and Fridays, then your brain's going to on Friday be like, oh, today's our day off, right? And then you're going to be like, yeah, sure, it can be my day off. I'll do it tomorrow. and then you won't do it, right? So consistency is super key. Even if you can only give yourself 60 seconds, I know the book says 12 minutes for 8 weeks. Just start somewhere, but
make it daily.
Make it. Yeah.
But not just probably not just daily, but also this roughly the same moment in your day, right?
Absolutely. Oh, in the same moment in your day. Like you're totally speaking my language and getting into my jam now.
Yeah. Well, that's something that's been helpful for me because I'm an early riser, and so I have like a sequence of things I do in the morning.
So
I get up, I read, and then I run. And if I don't do the same sequence of like get up at this time, have coffee, read for this amount of time, brush my teeth, drive to Oceanside, go on a 60-minute run. If I don't do that sequence of things, I'm kind of off for the day.
Yeah. That is pure gold for your brain. And yours is pretty intricate, but I'm guessing you've worked your way up to that.
Yeah.
And what I usually suggest to people is what's something you can do every day for 5 minutes, maybe 15 if you have that. But I get being a parent, I get all of that stuff and having multiple jobs and all the things. So what's something you can do every day for 5 minutes? And for me, sometimes it's that I get up, I drink a full glass of water, I brew a cup of tea. It's so important. Brew some, boil some hot water. Yeah, but it can be a ritual. Like add it to your ritual and your rhythm. And that's just further groundedness for your brain. So it can be as simple as, like you said, brewing a hot pot of coffee and watching the sunrise. Or if you're not an early riser, just standing there mindfully while your coffee brews, watching it brew. Just whatever you can do that's everyday, that's ritualistic, that's short. For me, I really encourage people to do things bite-sized because the science really shows that it's the consistency that's the most important. It's not the intricacies of it. And so what can you do that's actually attainable? The people that list things on their to-do list that they've already done just so they can check the box. That's what we want here. We want something what's something that you can do? Your ritual is awesome and I'm amazed. But don't expect that you're going to have a 60-minute run if you're not even running today.
Right.
Whoever's listening. What's 5 minutes that you could do?
Well, and that speaks to me too, because I have days where it's just not, it's not practical for me to read for an hour and then run for an hour. And then it's just there's days maybe I'm traveling or maybe I have I do film work. Maybe I have a shoot that day or something it's not practical for me to do that every day. And so my rhythm gets a little thrown off. So I'm still trying to, maybe I do need to incorporate some practices that are shorter that I can keep even on those sort of off days. Maybe I should do that.
Yeah, you should. Yeah. Because the body, the brain, they thrive on rhythm. We have two things in our bodies, and I'll go on a short tangent.
Please do.
Okay. I'm sure you've heard of the circadian rhythm, right? Which is the biological clock upon which our body functions. And if you're rising with the sun and going to bed with the moon, right, then we all have a similar clock. But there's also something else that we have that we all uniquely have. And we all have our own kind of clocks. And so some of us are early risers, some of us are night owls, and some of us kind of fall somewhere in between. So if you are not an early riser, if you're not an early bird, you don't want to tell yourself that I'm going to do this in the morning.
Yes.
Right? I think this is another trap that we fall into in Christianity where it's you have to have your morning quiet time. And if you're a night owl, you're not going to wake up for that time clock and you're not going to do it. And you'll just tell yourself, well, I'll do it tomorrow. And then guess what? You'll never do it.
And you'll feel like crap about it.
Yeah, totally.
When it was that isn't how you're wired to begin with.
That's right.
Yeah.
And we're all different in that sense. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I always suggest starting with something that's manageable. You're not going to be able to sit in a zazen practice for 20 minutes and then do a walking meditation and then sit, in your other half lotus on the other side for 20 more minutes. Like, that's not going to happen your first time. Do something that's manageable. And guided meditation for me is really helpful because when you're starting out, you need something to kind of ground you into that present moment, because we all have a monkey mind, right, that's just constantly going. And it's not easy to tame that without tools and without practice. It's all about practice.
Yeah. Yeah, I've heard it described. I think it was Science Mike that, I don't know if you're familiar with him, but I think he's described it as imagine you, and you're standing on the back of a dog or a puppy, and that puppy is standing on the back of an alligator. And that's basically your brain.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, and that sort of makes a lot of sense. Well, that's really, really good advice. So are there specific like resources you would recommend people going to for people that are just starting with the idea of meditation?
I mean, that's something that I definitely do in my community. So I think...
How can they find you then?
I mean, I think I have a tendency to be like, oh yeah, Deepak Chopra is great, or whatever. But yeah, that's definitely something that I'm passionate about, because for me, like, if you're deconstructing, it's really easy to get stuck down one path of like, what do I believe, right? Or forget what I believe. I want to focus on my body, right? But again, going back to that biopsychosocial, it's like all the things, mind, body, spirit, and being connected. Like, it's so important for us to be connected. So yeah, I mean, that's what I say, is that I'm a psychologist though, but I'm teaching people how to incorporate those experiential practices into their lives. But I would also say I really love the Calm app.
Yeah.
The Calm app is amazing. I mean, I use it like every day.
Do you?
So, yeah. So, I mean, I don't want to downplay that I can't also invite people into that thing, but Calm is so good.
Yeah.
And it has sleep stories and different things on it that, like music that is set to certain like beats per minute that helps you fall asleep and stuff like that,
right,
or helps you focus. The Calm app is amazing. So 100% I stand by the Calm app forever.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's just called Calm, CALM. Yeah. So that's so good. I love this because one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot recently is technology and how it's enabled us to do more things faster, which is supposed to be a good thing, right? But what many of us have done, and our culture has largely done, is instead of going like, oh, great, it takes us less time to do the same number of things. Instead of doing that, what we've done is we've gone, okay, so now we can take the same amount of time and do more things.
I know.
And I don't know if I've been sensing this a lot over the last few years, and then particularly coming out of this sort of COVID space, being like, I don't want to be as busy as I used to be.
Yeah.
And stressed all the time, and trying to do 18 things, but doing them all poorly.
Right.
And there's something about sort of Eastern philosophy and meditation and some of these practices that can really help sort of help us look at life a little bit differently, and ask ourselves, what's really important? How can I be present on what I'm doing, in what I'm doing right now? Have you seen that sort of show up in your life with some of these practices?
Oh yeah, that's absolutely a byproduct of all of this. And, the yogic principle is that the present is the breath. And I think for me, just for those who are listening who want to find that stream that connects maybe past history to these things that we're talking about that may feel foreign, I learned through experience that working on my breath would affect my mood and affect the way in which I was encountering the world. But then I began to learn that the word breath is the same in many languages as spirit. And then I began to learn that the words that are used in the Old and New Testament, ruach and pneuma, are the same words for breath and spirit.
Yep.
And then I began to unpack that in Genesis, when God makes man and woman, or man, I guess I should say, that he breathes a life into the man. Like, that's how the man came alive.
And Yahweh.
And Yahweh.
Yahweh is breath. And the Hebrews connected the idea of the soul with breath. So they didn't, unlike the Greeks, the ancient Hebrews didn't really believe in an immortal soul that was separable from the body. They connected the idea of the soul with breath, that it was intrinsically connected to your body. And so they believed that when you die, your soul, your breath, returns to the earth. It returns to nature, and it dissipates, right? And they sort of believe that it goes back to where it came from, because they're, according to Genesis 2, like their creation story of Adam and Eve, you're exactly right. It was the breath of God that animated the first human being. And actually, if you go back earlier than that, the Mesopotamian creation myth, Enuma Elish, in that myth, it was Marduk, one of the gods, Marduk. I don't know if you're familiar with this, but it predates Genesis. No. And a lot of the themes in Genesis actually seem to have been pulled from this ancient Mesopotamian mythology that predates it. And so in Enuma Elish, there's these two gods, Apsu and Tiamat, and they have younger gods, and one of the younger gods is Marduk. And Marduk goes to war with Tiamat, his mother, and actually slays her, and the way that he overpowers her is with wind. He opens her mouth and basically blasts in this godlike divine wind, and the wind kills Tiamat, and then Marduk makes all of the universe, all of creation from Tiamat's body. So that's part of this Mesopotamian creation myth. And so you have wind. I'm hijacking your point.
No, but it's so good.
I agree with you. Like you said, ruach. And Yahweh is referring to breath. So we have all these references to breath, wind, spirit. All of these ideas are connected in many, many religions, creation myths, all that stuff. So to bring it back to us in the present and think about, there's something that people have noticed about breath for a very, very, very long time. And it's one of those things that is like, if we're so busy, we aren't willing to think about these ideas that have been thought about for thousands of years. We're missing it. So that's why I love it. I mean, I feel like I hijacked a thread right there.
No.
But
no.
But yeah, breath.
I love it.
It's powerful.
Yeah, and it's so powerful, and it's the one thing that brings me back to the present, and brings me back to that slowing down that you're talking about. And I think that's one of the greatest gifts for me, stumbling into some of these Eastern practices and these gifts and these traditions, is that I'm able to step out of the constant chatter that's going on in my mind, whether it's just tasks or what I should do later, or whether it's anxiety, and to just be in the moment and to be mindful. And it sounds so cliche until you've experienced it. But then, like I said earlier, it's really hard to articulate with words. And it's just beautiful, and it's liberating, and it's freeing, and it just feels like what it should feel like to be a human being. And all of the things that we get caught up in individualistic societies and independent societies just frankly don't matter, you know? And that, like you said, it's being there with your kid or your dog or the sunlight or the wind in your hair. And honestly, for me, I was never able to tap into that or understand it or know it until I started practicing things like breathing and pranayama and meditation and mindful movement.
That's so good. Someone gave me this recommendation that instead of saying amen, you can, the Gen Z thing to say is just mood.
Oh, really?
So I was just like, preach. And then I was like, oh, no, mood. Yeah.
The thing I've learned is
oh
this.
Yeah, that's saying like poetry, right? Or spoken
Zoom.
word. It's like that instead of clapping.
Yeah, the way to not be distracting, but I get the amen or the preach. But yeah, I'm not Gen Z, so
neither am
I feel like I am, you know, I'm like, I'm still 20. Like, who are these 20-year-olds not thinking that I'm young? But
no part of me feels 20.
I'm not.
None. All the joints are creaking. I'm like,
oh, please,
I was right when COVID hit, I was training for a marathon. Like I've done a few half marathons, but I've never done a full. And like a full is a whole other animal.
Oh man, it's a beast.
But I started having knee problems, and I'm just like, I hate aging. It's the worst. But on that note, flexibility is one of the most important things. Flexibility and strength are I think two of the most important physical sort of things you can work on to, you know, with regards to aging. As far as maybe you probably know more about that than me, but that's my understanding. And so yoga can actually help with both of those. Not to reduce it to a physical thing like we've talked about, but
no, but it's true. For me, I had low back pain for years and years and years because I didn't know how to stand properly. Like, we aren't taught these things. And that's something that, you know, with yoga and its mindfulness and its attuneness to your body, you learn how to place your feet when you stand and etc. And my lower back pain is gone.
That's amazing. Oh, Katie. Well, this has been such an awesome conversation. I feel like we sort of only scratched the surface. Like, I feel like there's so much more we could talk about. So we'll have to do this again sometime. But for those people that are watching and listening and are curious to learn more about you and connect with you, how can people find you? Yeah,
so I'm on all the socials, maybe except for TikTok. That probably shows my age. I'm not sure there.
TikTok is really fun, but it requires a lot of time investment, and I don't have it. So Instagram is probably a good place for people to find you.
Instagram, I love to hang out there. I'm Dr. Katie Blake, Dr. Doctor. My website's drkatieblake.com. Yeah, in a couple of weeks, I'm planning to announce a self-study course that I have that is for deconstructing women and is kind of incorporating a lot of these things that we've talked about, just like psychological concepts and tools like setting boundaries and identity, but also experiential practices. Yeah. Like embodiment and, learning how to meditate and breathe for anxiety and stress and all of that. So, if you're looking for tools, I'd be so willing to direct you in great places and would love to know you.
I've learned so much from you in this conversation and, you know, as we've talked privately before. So thank you for having this conveation.
Thank you. This was a blast.
So awesome. Thank you for doing it.
Love the work you're doing in the world.
You too. I feel the same way about you.
I know it's a huge risk to step out and
I'm just operating in my 8-ness.
Be honest.
I'm just in my 8-ness.
I love it though. It's so important. Keep it up.
Thank you so much, Katie. Okay, so that was my conversation with Dr. Katie Blake. I hope you all loved it as much as I did. And I'm just really grateful for all of you that are joining me on this journey and watching and listening and giving me your feedback. So hit me up on Instagram or Twitter, John Steingard, or just if you're watching on YouTube, leave a comment below and let me know what you thought of this episode. I love getting your feedback every week, so hit me up and let me know. Until next time, thank you guys so much for listening and for watching. I hope you have a great week. And until then, stay curious.